1 second. Could members of the Berkeley Elliott School please introduce themselves and your role in this debate as well?
I'm going to be the Prime Minister. My name is Alessandra Malitzis.
And then I'm going to be, we have feedback in this room, sorry. I'm going to be the second speaker. My name is Elliot Hertenstein. We'll try to reduce the feedback here as much as possible.
And the other school, please.
Hi, so we're from Ridge. We are the opposition. The first opposition speaker is Shruti, that's me, and their second opposition speaker is Sharia.
All right. Would it be all right with you guys if we record this debate?
Oh, I'm sorry. It was a little, you were cutting in and out. Can you repeat that?
Would it be okay with you guys if we record this debate?
Yeah. Also, is verbal POIs okay for everybody? All right. If everybody.
Yeah. So, Joel, so since they agreed to record this Zoom, this meeting, I think you can start recording.
Should I start?
Oh, just 1 second.
Okay.
I just pasted the resolution in the chat for clarity. But yeah, we're good to start.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, so thank you everyone for being here. The first speaker, you have 7 minutes to speak. I will let you know when your time is up, and you may begin when you're ready.
All right. I don't need to read the whole resolution. I'm just going to read the end, but everybody has the resolution in the chat and they can get the gist. But all right. My name is Alessandra Malitzis. I'm going to be the Prime Minister and I'm going to start my time now. So I'm the first speaker of government affirming the resolution that this House would add impact on low middle income countries as a third and equal policy objective for the Federal Reserve. So we're defining low middle income countries. The exact definition is countries with a gross national income per capita of $1,000. Examples are Cambodia, Indonesia, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. So, and the weighting mechanism is going to be net benefits. So policy objectives are defined as what is the U.S. Federal Reserve trying to achieve. Things stated in the resolution, such as maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates in the United States. So the plan, of course, is going to be for the U.S. Federal Reserve to consider the impact on low middle income countries when making decisions and use this impact to inform their decisions. The actor would be the US federal government and the time frame would be as soon as possible. So first contention is benefits to other countries. Now, subpoint A is about debt. So the Federal Reserve has influence over the value of a dollar. This means influence over the debt of other countries because if the value of a dollar goes up, so does the debt of other countries. Now, other countries are supposed to follow the word of the Federal Reserve. So if interest and value rates, if interest and value goes up, we will leave countries with an unpayable amount of inflated debt. So for clarification, the US dollar going up isn't bad as long as other countries are also going up. So it needs to be even. But if the federal when other countries don't have an even inflation rate, it hurts them severely because, again, they're left with an unpayable amount of debt. So subpoint B is, yes?
Yeah, so you say that as long as other countries are going up, what happens if one country out of all of the low and middle income countries is in a recession? Does that mean the Federal Reserve can't do anything to help other countries, or do we just collapse all policy action from the Federal Reserve because one country's in debt? How does that work?
we're keeping in mind the interests of lower middle income countries. So if a lower middle income country is affected by a policy that the Federal Reserve is making, obviously that's going to be accounted for in decision making. So subpoint B is employment and economy. So if countries are left with an unpayable amount of debt, the US economy is bad, other countries' economies go down. So if the economy goes down, this leads to issues with unemployment, reduced income and wealth, job uncertainty, and overall lower quality of life for these people living in these countries. So of course, the impacts that we see here are the country's quality of life goes down, and of course, people suffer the negative economic effects and impacts. So the second contention that we have is about benefits to the United States. So what we see is more wealthy countries lead to more scientific research, and people are better educated. The world as a whole is able to make decisions about our future. So subpoint A, it prevents negative feedback loops. So essentially, the US receives resources from other countries. For example, we get flowers from Holland. So if the US hurts the debt of Holland, then our flowers are more expensive, which is detrimental for the people of the US. Of course, this is a very light example, but it's used more as an analogy, because obviously this applies to deeper issues, such as how countries like, obviously, this applies to much deeper issues than, flowers from Holland. But the idea is that if the U.S. hurts the debt of a country that is giving us things that we need, then resources become more expensive, our economy is hurt, and essentially everybody's economy goes down. And it goes the other way around. It works the other way around in terms of the fact that no, thank you. It works the other way around in terms of when the U.S. is benefiting, has like an increased economy, the U.S. economy grows and it helps other countries, especially when the U.S. federal government is taking other lower income countries into consideration. And this leads to a positive feedback loop. So essentially, if we're not actively hurting these countries and we're keeping their interests in mind when we're decision making, they're not going to actively hurt us back. If we create a positive feedback loop where we're not leaving low-income countries in an unpayable, inflated amount of debt, they're probably not going to raise their prices, and we're going to be able to continue gathering resources from them in a way that doesn't hurt. In a way that doesn't hurt our economy, it doesn't hurt their economy. And overall, there are not many negative impacts, or there are no negative impacts to this, because when we see in this positive feedback, no, thank you. In this positive feedback loop, it's quite literally that if we just keep in mind the interest of countries with less money than us, we can quite literally protect our own economy from inflation by protecting other people's economies from inflation. So the impacts, of course, are the US economy is overall better, people have jobs, and we're not seeing these negative impacts of a poor economy as stated in the other contention of how in the opposition world, what we're seeing is a lot of economic instability. We're seeing a lot of negative impact regarding the livelihood of citizens. And for all those reasons, I urge a strong government ballot.
Thank you. Is the next speaker ready?
Yep. Can you just give me 1 second to get to my stand?
Sure.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah? Okay. So the order of this speech is going to be the negative constructive speech, so the opposition case, and then moving on to the government. Is everyone ready? Okay, perfect. I'll take that as a yes, and we can start time now. I negate resolved. Let's talk about some observations before we move into the framing and the contentions. There's 3. First, this resolution asks us to consider low and middle income countries equally to the other 2 priorities of the Federal Reserve. It's not just about considering the impact that we have on other countries, but rather giving them equal consideration to United States interests. Read the resolution. Our argument is not that we shouldn't consider low and middle income countries in our calculus, but rather that they shouldn't be prioritized equally to us. And that is the burden of the government side to prove, which they have failed to do in their case, because their entire case just tells us why we should consider other countries, not why we should consider them equally. But secondly, our second observation is the fact that Oh, wait, sorry, my dock just crashed. I'll move on to the second observation is the fact that there are around 109 low and middle income countries in the world, and the resolution asks us to consider U.S. economic policy for every single one of those countries equally before the Federal Reserve does anything. This means that every single country out of those 109 needs to be taken into equal consideration. Observation 3 is that the resolution only says we should consider the impact of our policy, not whether the impact is positive or negative, which means they can't actually solve for any of their offense. Remember, all we have to do is take into consideration the fact that we could have a negative impact, but that doesn't solve back for the fact that the negative impact could happen at all. It's not about negative or positive. Let's move on to the framing of this round. We say that the value in this round, which they don't actually provide, should be governmental legitimacy. The resolution talks about the United States federal government as an actor, and the Federal Reserve is part of the United States government, and it's the government's responsibility to protect its own people first. This framework on face negates because it tells you that we shouldn't be prioritizing other countries before we put ourselves first. Let's move on to contention 1 of inaction. The Federal Reserve seeks to prevent large economic recessions and high inflation rates. The reason why it's been so effective in the past is because it acts quickly and decisively. Taking every 109 of those countries into consideration prevents any action from ever being taken. It doesn't make any sense to prioritize. Sure.
Why does this prevent any action from being taken?
Sure, I'll get to that. There's 2 responses to that. First, it's the fact that every single country has different economic policy and different economic motives, which means if we take into consideration how one policy hurts one country but helps the other, if it hurts one country, we take that into equal consideration, which means there's literally never any way for us to be able to take any decisive action. It doesn't make sense to prioritize 109 countries equally because they all have different needs. This means all the effectiveness of the Federal Reserve is taken away. Even if you think we could balance the motivations of every single one of those 109 countries, remember that the reason why the Federal Reserve is so effective right now is because the dollar, it acts decisively and quickly. But taking every single country into consideration equally means that it's not just about the United States, but it's about 110 other countries that we're looking towards, the United States and 109 included, which means we take away all effectiveness from the Federal Reserve and we take away their biggest asset, which is acting decisively. The Federal Reserve is literally known for acting quickly, from lowering or increasing interest rates to stop recessions. And without this, banks in the United States would collapse, but also the value of the dollar would collapse. The impact is economic instability. The United States needs to help itself before others. And if the United States market isn't regulated with the utmost priority, the economy collapses. They themselves tell you that the economy of other countries is dependent on the United States. This is why we should take the United States into consideration first, and U.S. stability should always come first. Remember, our thesis again and again is not that we shouldn't look to low-income countries, but just that we shouldn't prioritize the needs of low-income and middle-income countries equal to the United States, because the United States dollar stability is a prerequisite to being able to achieve any sort of progress in these countries as well. But our second subpoint here is that each country has its own economic needs and wants. It's impossible to prioritize every country when making a decision, especially because our economic system of capitalism inherently involves trade-offs. For example, if one country is gaining wealth, it's usually coming from somewhere else, probably another country or another group, which means there's always trade-offs happening. And when there's these sort of large trade-offs happening, there is no way for us to be able to consider every single country, especially if something helps like the United States but might harm some smaller countries. If we have to take all of that into consideration, there is near zero way for the United States to have any sort of economic policy. This means that the United States can never put its own interests first, which makes it lose dollar hegemony. Contention 2 is Federal Reserve credibility. This inaction means countries like China, who already want the rest of the world to use their yuan instead of the American dollar, will act more decisively. Especially in a time of uncertainty, this policy prevents the United States dollar from being stable and allows other more authoritarian regimes to exercise dollar hegemony. Our argument is simple. The dollar is strong because the Federal Reserve makes strong decisions that are very quick. They have the burden to prove that taking every single 109 countries into consideration doesn't mean that we will take time, which is just not the case. Contention 3 is recession. We need to focus on the United States' domestic problems before we can focus on international ones. Look to the fact that right now, like the past year alone, inflation rates have reached more than 200% of what they normally are. We need to help ourselves before we can help others. And with our high rates of unemployment from the COVID pandemic and just recovering from multiple different recessions because of the pandemic, we need to be able to fix domestic policy first before we can help other countries. And that means putting ourselves first in order to help other countries as well. Let's move on to the affirmative case. Let's first, an overview to their arguments. Remember that they provide no framework. So we say that the United States government effectiveness is going to be the number one way that you should evaluate and frame your impacts. Insofar as none of their impacts link into our framework and they don't make any analysis as to why they do, you should automatically be inclined towards voting negative. But then let's move on to their plan. They say that the United States Federal Reserve should consider the impact on low and middle income countries. But the key word they leave out here is it's not just about considering, but it's about considering them equally. And none of their case talks about why equal consideration is important. It just says consideration is important. On contention one about benefits to other countries, they say that the United States influences the value of the dollar, and if the dollar goes up, so does debt. But the problem is that low and middle income countries are affected by almost every single thing, and every country is affected differently, which means we take time. But secondly, they say that as long as other countries are also going up, you're allowed to make a policy. But what happens when a country is in a constant recession and for example, if one country out of the 109 is in a recession, do we just do absolutely nothing that we were going to do because that country's economy isn't helped? Look to what they say. They say as long as other countries' economies are going up, we're allowed to make the policy. But what happens when a country's in a downward recession and our policy is not going to help that recession? Does one country outweigh the rest of the 109? And we say no, because the resolution asks us to look towards every single one equally, which means there's no way for us to have any decisive action at all. Sorry. Wait, my speech is 8 minutes, not 7.
Oh, apologies. Continue. Sorry.
Okay, I think I have like a minute left, so I can restart in a minute.
Yeah, I'll restart the time.
Okay, cool. Then they make arguments about how the quality of life is lowered, but look to the fact that the Federal Reserve doesn't actually have any sort of control over that. Even if we increased or decreased our inflation rates, countries are still going to be in debt. And their arguments about debt forgiveness can be turned because we say debt forgiveness increases inflation, but also decreases the value of the US dollar and increases our own domestic debt. There is no way for us to help everyone when we can't put ourselves first. On contention 2 about preventing a negative feedback, you should look to the fact that they give you only one example of Holland and flowers. First, we say that if a policy hurts the US, we shouldn't do it. So any impact about how some economy impacts the United States is already taken into consideration. But secondly, you should look to the fact that debt, the only example they even give you in the speech is literally about Holland, which isn't even a low income or middle income country. They have zero examples to actually back up their case. They're just making hypotheses about what could possibly happen. At the end of the day, even if negative feedback loops are true, if it detrimentally impacts the United States, we already take that into consideration, and the Federal Reserve already handles that.
Thank you. Is the next speaker ready?
Yep. We're going to fix this.
Your time is 8 minutes, and you may begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, cool. I'm just going to get my timer set up here. And off time roadmap, I guess I'll go over the top of case and then opposition case and then our case. Okay, and my time is going to start now. So I just want to start out by pointing out that my opponents here say that we didn't define a weighing mechanism, or they talk about a weighing mechanism as the US. And I'd like to point out that in our first speech, we defined the weighing mechanism as net benefits to all. And this really comes in important later. I just wanted to point this out, that this was uncontested. There was no argumentation for why the US would be a better weighing mechanism. We already defined the weighing mechanism as that is the burden of the government in this debate. Okay, so now I'm going to go to opposition case. So they have a bunch of these observations. They talk about how the resolution asks us to consider low and middle income countries equally. And this is one of the main misconceptions in this debate, and I really want to point this out. When they say equally, what they mean is we are taking these considerations that we are making, these observations about other countries, and we are using them as a whole equally with the US. It's not like saying oh, the US is just one country out of however many, 109. We're pointing out that these considerations, we're looking at these 109 countries, and then as a group, we're taking those considerations and using them to influence policy decisions, right? And so that's really important when we go on to the rest of our debate, where they talk about framing, and it's impossible to take 109 countries because let's say one country has this thing going on. Well, that's completely irrelevant, because equally within this debate means that we can say, well, if there's one country, they're an outlier. And so we don't really use that consideration when making the full decision. What equally means here is that we are using we are using observations about the rest of the world and taking those observations into account equally the observations, not all the other countries, with our observations about our own country. Like, for example, observations about inflation or observations about losing jobs. So opposition continues to go on about how like every country has different economic policies. Again, this comes under how we're lumping all the countries together, and this was stated in the first speech. And then we also say that they say like the U.S. Federal Reserve has to act quickly, and this really doesn't make any sense because observations don't like take time. It's not like we're negotiating with other countries. We're just observing the current state of other countries. We don't have to like go interview, the Prime Minister of South Africa. All we have to do is go talk to go make an observation about these low and middle income countries and then use those observations to influence our decisions. So this just doesn't make any sense that it would take longer than like our current observations, because that's what we're doing now. We're just observing the US and making decisions based on that. And then they also say like the economy of other countries should come first, which doesn't make, like we have to argue that, which doesn't make any sense. And again, that's not what the resolution is about. And then they also talk about how like countries will act more decisively. And they basically say that like we have to, we have the burden to prove that all 109 countries have the same needs. And this kind of goes back to our main contentions, which I'm going to cover in a second, which is basically that helping other countries equally with us helps ourselves. Because we are reliant on so many of these low and middle income countries, which I will name a few. Holland, I'd like to point out, which is a metaphor, and again, I'll get into this later. It helps the U.S. even if you take the opposition like weighing mechanism, or not opposition weighing mechanism, but this strange argument about equality into account, which we've already proved is not true. So now let's move on to government debate or government case here, right? So our first contention is basically, well, actually, let's go over a plan first. So our plan basically says the U.S. Federal Reserve will consider the impact, and will consider it equally, because that's what's in the resolution, on low and middle income countries when making decisions, and they'll use this impact to determine, and they'll use this to inform their decisions, basically. And we agree that it's equally in the resolution. And so all the equally does is that it helps our 2 points, our 2 contentions, right? Because if we're taking it into account equally, it means that A, under net benefits, most of the world is going to be better. And this obviously is winning under net benefits. Like if we're considering other countries equally, it means that everyone is going to be benefited. And we win under net benefits. Like this is a government this is a government argument basically. And then our second contention about how like US helping other countries kind of helps ourselves. Again, we win under the government's arguments, right? We're saying that the government as a whole can help other countries. If the US helps other countries, it'll also help themselves. And we talk about like getting flowers from Holland. I thought that was a cute analogy. Apparently it wasn't. So I'm going to offer some other examples. For example, US is reliant on oil from Venezuela, or what happened to my thing? Oh, I clicked on the wrong tab. Oil from Venezuela, or like coal from South Africa, right? So we have these reliances on low and middle income countries. And so we're able to use these reliances to kind of boost. If the economy of these countries is boosted, then it means it's going to help the US because we're not paying like super inflated prices for these things that the US relies on. And then, so let's just go back over this here because, oh, sorry, one more thing that I wanted to talk about. On our first contention under our impacts, we talk about how like the quality of life in other countries go down. They talk about the Federal Reserve has no impact on the quality of life, and that's a quote. And that doesn't make any sense. Like if the US Federal Reserve had no impact on the quality of life of people in the US or anywhere else, it like would not exist because then it's irrelevant. So it obviously does have impacts on the quality of life. But secondly, I just want to make it really clear that these impacts, what the Federal Reserve is doing to make decisions about the US economy does impact other countries a ton. And so these decisions, it's important to take these decisions into account under net benefits because we want to help other countries. We want everyone to be as well off as possible under net benefits, the weighing mechanism that we defined at the beginning of the round. And so we win under this, right? Because all of our arguments say that we're helping other countries and we also help the US. Everyone wins. But even if you don't take into consideration our contention about helping the US, we still win under net benefits because we're helping all the other countries in the world. And then one last thing here, I just wanted to clarify this positive feedback loop metaphor because I feel like it's been something that's kind of been misunderstood throughout the round. So basically what we're saying with a positive feedback loop metaphor here is that we're saying that in the US gives aid to other countries, especially low and middle income countries. Those countries will like develop more scientific research. They're going to help the US and their economy is going to do better, which is going to help the US. And I like to point out my opponents totally drop our argument about how lower income countries developing scientific research helps society as a whole. this just goes unresponded to. Is an incredibly important argument when weighing under net benefits. So I'm gonna check my timer here. Cool. So I have a little bit of time, I'm just gonna recap our points here. So basically what we say is that while the US takes this into consideration equally, we agree with this, you're helping net benefits. You're helping the most people in the world. You're helping all these other countries. And so more people are benefited, right? This is exactly what net benefits is trying to accomplish. But not only is it helping all the other countries, it's also helping the US and the citizens of the US. Because when low income countries are like invested in and their economies aren't terrible, then it means that they're going to grow as countries. They're going to not maybe they're low and middle income. And that means that the people of those countries are going to benefit, and they're going to be able to contribute more to like research and kind of progression of society as a whole. And we tell you that this is good just because like we have a lot of pressing issues facing our world right now, like climate change or like, I don't know, poverty is another huge one. And so just allowing these countries to put research and put effort into these problems basically benefits society as a whole, and we clearly win under net benefits. So for all these reasons, I urge a strong government ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. Is the next speaker ready? Your time is 8 minutes, and you may begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, so I'll start. I'll start my 8-minute speech on my first word. So actually, sorry, the order of this speech is going to be framing, net case, aff case. So I'll start my timer now. Let's start off with framing for the round. They tell you to evaluate the round on net benefits, but they concede the fact that the United States is the actor, and the United States is a government, which means it has a duty to protect its people. The United States government has a duty to protect the people inside of the United States first. This means you can extend our arguments of government legitimacy. As an actor, it is the duty of the federal government to prioritize the Americans before we prioritize people from the nations around the world. Okay, look to the definition of equal. It's going to be really important. Bringing equal means being the same in quantity, size, degree, or value. This is important because this means we literally value other countries just as much as the United States. Therefore, going against like what the role of the United States actually is, right? Don't let them try to shift our outlier countries, because they have the burden to defend them equally, right? They say observations don't take time, but yes, they do, Judge. Observation require data you have to collect in order to be accurate. You need economic theorists and modelists to predict the impact of a policy on each and every 109 different countries, right? For example, the economic needs for South Korea are going to be vastly different than the economic needs of South Africa, for example, right? So you cannot lump them all into one bag. Every nation is different, and they're definitely not going to be the same. Okay, onto their case. They say that it would help every country, including the US, but that's not true, Judge. We say that US dollar stability is a prerequisite to helping out other countries, and that doesn't happen when we equally consider every single country, right? The resolution itself says that that many of these countries rely on the US dollar, and now that we are actually like just taking away the legitimacy of the US dollar because of inflation, and like as my partner said, inflation is up by 200%. This is going to delegitimize the US dollar and impact these countries even more. Our impact comes first because we're talking about inflation that is happening right now in the status quo. Okay. Onto their argument about like US is reliant on oil from Venezuela. This literally is not true. The United States is reliant on oil from like Canada, Mexico, and the Middle East, right? So onto their case, they concede our turn that any debt forgiveness is awful for the stability of the dollar and leads to forgiveness. You can thus turn all their arguments and that the argument that they make about why research even happens, but there is hyperinflation, so we can't really do that, right? Okay, let's move on to our case. Starting off, they say that it doesn't matter if one country is wrong because one country is always going to be an outlier. But Judge, I believe I've accurately responded to this. Okay, every one of these countries are going to have a different policy, right? It varies country by country. You cannot lump every single country into a bag, right? And you can't like put it into two categories. Either you're the US or you're every other country, because these countries are going to have different statuses, different economic systems, and like a bunch of different factors are going to come to play, right? Then like they talk about how like helping other countries helps us. Okay, Judge, they give you the example of Holland giving us flowers. First of all, like Holland is not a low middle class company, a low middle income country. So they really have no evidence whatsoever in this round. Who exactly are we talking about? Judge, we don't really know because they don't give you any countries, right? We have a 200% inflation, and as the resolution says that the United States dollar is very important. Therefore, like we must solve, if we really want to solve for those nations, then we need to make sure that the Federal Reserve actually solves for these issues first. Then they talk about how like the most of the world is going to get better and everyone's going to get jobs and everyone's going to be happy, right? Judge, this is not all sparkles and rainbows. Think about this. Most of the world is going to have different issues, and if the United States dollar is going to crash because we're valuing all these other nations equally, then they're going to suffer even more, right? Because as I've said before, the economic needs are going to be different, and if the dollar crashes, then nations all around the world are going to be hurt because of the United States dollar hedge. They talk about how they want everyone to be as well off as possible, but Judge, you are hurting right now with the policies because now the U.S. has to pick and choose what countries it wants to benefit because they can't really like decide what nations are going to benefit the most, right? And because of these reasons, it's an easy ballot for the AF. There's some things that you can cleanly extend here. First of all, the Federal Reserve credibility, right? In this consensus, we tell you that the inaction means that countries like China, who already want the rest of the world to use their yuan instead of the American dollar, will act more decisively, especially in a time of uncertainty. This policy prevents the U.S. dollar from being stable and allows other more authoritarian regimes to start from like exercising dollar hegemony, right? So our argument is simple. We're saying that the dollar is strong because of the Federal Reserve. If we're prioritizing these other things equally, we're not going to solve for the issue that's happening in the status quo. And insofar as the resolution says equally, that means that we're going to be looking at our issues the same as looking at the issues of these other countries. But we need to solve back for what's happening right now. If the Fed has to take in the info of 109 different countries equally, we're going to have a problem. This is simply something that we cannot solve yet. And we must solve for an inflation first, leading on to my third contention about a recession, which is also cold conceded. We need to focus on the US. There's high inflation, and we're on the verge of recession, right? Especially with what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war. The best way to solve back is by focusing on improving the lives of people by solving back for the high inflation, and it prevents us from focusing on ourselves. Their own cases is about two other countries, and like. Yeah, so we really need to focus on what's happening right now, and everything they tell you is like their biggest example here is literally flowers from Holland, Judge. And we're talking about a declining recession. We're talking about a recession, and people are going to lose their jobs. Prices are going to go up. Tell me, Judge, what do you think is more important in this round? Whether we get flowers from like a really well-off country that's in Europe, or whether we're going to get whether we're going to be able to stop recession and high inflation. Okay, now onto their oil. Their oil argument is really one of the biggest issues here because they say like we need to invest in countries like Venezuela, right? And because they're giving us most of the oil. But once again, Judge, that's not true whatsoever because we get most of our oil from Canada and Mexico and the Middle East, right? They're the nations who are providing us with the oil that we need. And by the way, like Canada, first of all, is in no regard a low middle income country, and the Middle East is also, very rich, especially with them having the organization like OPEC, right? So they're obviously making a lot of money. That is not the issue whatsoever. Okay, I'll tell you what your vote. They can see that if an economic policy helps the U.S., we would still do it, right? Okay, so what this round is coming down to, so they can see that if the economy is benefiting, then the rest of the world also benefits. So this argument goes clean on your flow. Okay, Judge, this is what the round comes down to. We are the only side that are preventing a recession, that are preventing people from losing their jobs, that are preventing we're trying to mitigate 200% inflation, and we're the only side that's actually focusing on helping the people of this nation first. In fact, we also help the people of the other nation because of their reliance on the U.S. hedge. All they do is get worried about flowers in Holland. And Judge, that's why I urge you to vote for the negative in this debate.
Thank you. Is the next speaker ready? Your time is 4 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Can everyone hear me okay? Cool. The order of this speech is going to be just key voters and points of clash. I'll start off with the framing debate and then move down the flow. Everyone ready? Cool. Take that as yes. We can start time now. There are 4 key ways you can cleanly vote negative in this round. The first is going to be the framing debate. You should extend our framework of government legitimacy. A government is no longer legitimate when it does not prioritize its own people. That's not a government anymore, it's a charity. And there is no way for us to have a functional government if we equally prioritize the gains of every single other country instead of just us. Even if they try to come up here and make an argument as to why we would lump all the countries together and consider that equally, that still violates our framework, which tells you that a government's responsibility, it's to its own people first, which fundamentally negates the resolution because the resolution says we prioritize everyone equally. Then even if you should extend our analysis because they don't give you any reason why we should prioritize net benefits. But even under net benefits, they can see that the United States has to have a strong dollar stability and the strong US economy in order to help other countries, which means the United States always comes first and is a prerequisite to helping other countries. They concede this when they tell us that the economy of the United States is, and the way that the United States conducts policy is what impacts other countries. So if the United States dollar stability goes down or the economy of the United States declines, then that's going to also negatively impact other countries, which is another warrant for why we have to look at the United States first. And both of these reasons on face negate, because it negates the fact that we should look at everything equally. Our argument is no, you should still prioritize the United States. Now, let's move on to 3 reasons why we win under their under net benefits and our framing. First is time. This is going to be extremely important. Our argument is that the Federal Reserve prides itself on being able to decisively take action during times of economic instability. The problem is that if you have to take into consideration 109 different countries, even if you don't take into every single country into consideration, but that's not true because we say you consider them equally. Even if that's not the case, our opponent comes up in his last speech and tries to say that observations don't take time. This is completely nonsensical. In order to make accurate observations of an economic impact, not only do you need to hypothesize what actually happens when you implement something, which needs economists and multiple theories and implementation, but secondly, you need to go and observe in countries. You don't have to physically be there, but you still need to make observations, which take time. And you still need to gather data, which takes way more time than the Federal Reserve has in order to solve instability. Their argument just does not make sense here. At the end of the day, even if they try to tell you it doesn't take time, the fact is that it does. It takes more time than it would if the United States could just consider itself, which means that now we have the Federal Reserve not being able to take decisive action. This is a prerequisite to the United States economy staying strong, because the Federal Reserve comes into play during times of recession and during times where we need an actor to act as fast as possible. On our second voter, it's going to be dollar stability. We say that when the United States prioritizes other countries as well, and also leads to debt forgiveness, you decrease the stability of the dollar. Remember that the first constructive speaker of the affirmative side talks about how debt forgiveness means that you could increase research opportunities, and debt forgiveness is really good in order to be able to help other countries get out of debt. But they concede our analysis as to why that is really, really bad for not only developing countries, but United States dollar stability. If the Federal Reserve could just forgive every foreign debt because it considers both the United States and that country equal, then there would be A, no way for the dollar to continue its hegemony, but B, there would be no way for the United States to continue funding programs and funding the United States dollar in the first place. Look, the round comes down really, really easily. At best, they make arguments about how some countries might be helped and how and how under net benefits, that's a good thing. But our argument is that they themselves concede in order for other countries to be helped, you need the United States to be prosperous first, because every other country relies on the United States dollar to be strong. And all of our arguments indicate to you that the United States dollar is not strong anymore when you prioritize every other country equally. It's not about considering every country, but rather whether we should consider them equal to the United States. And our answer will always be a resounding no.
Thank you. Is the last speaker ready? Your time is 5 minutes.
All right. I'm the last speaker for the government, and I'm going to start my time now. All right. I'm going to go over 2 main voting issues that are widely disputed in the round. Now, the first main voting issue is very simple. I think opposition vastly overcomplicated the topic by throwing around a lot of information very quickly. When really it only comes down to 2 main things. And the first is, should priority go to the actor? Now, the opposition's entire case relies on this idea that we must give the United States priority always. Now, first things first, they made arguments about how we're not working under their framework when it is not the opposition burden to provide framework. It is the government burden. It's the opposition's burden to dispute the framework if they would like different framework, which they did not do. So essentially, we're going under the government framework because it was just not disputed, and it was the government burden to create framework in the first place. So under government framework, this net benefits, it's thrown around a lot. It's stated a lot of times, opposition says net benefits works in their favor. However, listen, net benefits includes everybody, not just the United States. So for the opposition to state in the same sentence that the U.S. should be prioritized first and be the top priority, and we should focus all our resources on the U.S. and the U.S. is on top, the U.S. and the U.S. and the U.S. And then in the same sentence, state that that's net benefits, that for everybody to not keep anyone else's interest in mind is not, it's not a argument that's beneficial to their side of the debate. So government tells you, again, that net benefits is what we're weighing on. We care about all countries, not just the US. Under net benefits, we can't be weighing on just the US. That is a fact. We cannot be prioritizing one country that does not make up. They said it themselves, 109 countries. We're going to say that under net benefits, one country is more important than 109 other countries. So, okay, OP tells you should prioritize the US. Now, I'm going to do some world-to-world comparison. So in the government world, what we see is that we are keeping the interest of lower income countries in mind. Now, the opposition states that the government burden was to justify how we're going to give 109 countries equal representation when making legislation, which is quite literally not the government burden. And my partner already went over this in his speech. It is absolutely not government burden to prove why we need to give 109 countries equal representation. The burden of the government is to prove that these lower income countries should be considered equally, as a whole, these low-income countries should be considered equally in decisions that affect them. The answer is always going to be yes, because these decisions affect them. We spoke extensively about how the debt could bankrupt these countries and the inflation affects them. We talked about all sorts of things I'm going to go over in my second voting issue, but we cannot pretend that under net benefits, the interest of the US is going to be prioritized over all else. Now, the second main voting issue is benefits to the United States, because this is what's been disputed. I mean, clearly the opposition does not really care about the interest of low-income countries, because their entire speech is just, we should only care about the US. So we're going to talk about benefits to the US, and we're going to talk about how under the opposition framework that we should prioritize the US, we still win. So government tells you, what does government tell you? They tell you about the negative and positive feedback loops. Government tells you how government never said that that these low-income countries are number one oil producers. We stated that these countries give us resources. We stated that it's all trade. It's all trade. If a country's economy is doing well, other countries' economies are going to do well, because we get the US benefits from other countries doing well. There's no motivation to want a country to not do well. So government also tells you how, reliance on other countries in trade and how we benefit from other countries having strong economies. Government tells you whether opposition, misinterprets whether opposition misinterprets an analogy about flowers and ignores points and claims we have no case, it does not change the fact that under net benefits, other countries' interests are important, and two, the opposition's burden. And two, helping other countries positively impacts the United States economy and positively impacts the United States. And opposition's entire argument can just be summed up to the fact that we should prioritize the U.S. and not think about other countries, which is not going to benefit the U.S. It's not going to benefit other countries, and in general, we win under net benefits. And for all of those reasons, I urge a strong government ballot.
All right, thank you everyone for that debate. I'm just going to take 2-3 minutes to finalize my decisions, and so please stick around for a bit.
All right, thanks so much.
So I have come up with my decision. Is everyone here?
Yep, we're here.
So thank you everyone for that debate. And just congratulations for debating that topic. If I had to make a decision, the win goes to the opposition side. And I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about the generic the debate. So firstly, about framing, the opposition side did a really good job weighing the framing mechanism. You talked about how the role of the government is to support its own citizens over other countries. So that was really valid. The government side, you could have there was an opportunity for you to challenge that notion by challenging the philosophy that a government is more entitled to support their citizens. You could have went on to talk about how a government role is not limited to their people, but so that was a missed opportunity. So it would have been better if you engaged in a more constructive debate on that point. So firstly, talking about the government side, the point about Poland, I just want to say, like, generically, we spent too much time talking about the Poland example, which is such a small and non-important issue. So, like, the opposition side, the judges will be able to decide whether that example is good or bad. So there's no need to spend so much time on it. Generally, you do not want to, use symbolic examples to support your debate because this is not like a literature class, right? So it is better to use like practical, real examples other than symbolic ones. So please just keep that in mind for future debates. There was a point that the government side mentioned of, I think it was like China, right? How forcing the United States to consider other nations will decrease its competitiveness to other countries like China. That point was brought up by the first leader of opposition, but then it was never brought up for the entirety of the debate, right? So like the government side, you could have contested that and perhaps you could have won that point, but since no one actually brought it up, the opposition side just naturally won that point. So please just make sure to, when you're rebutting your opponent's argument, just make sure that you're challenging every single point they bring. As for the opposition side, you guys did a really good job, structuring your debate and everything, but I did feel like you guys spent too much time talking about dollar stability, which is all good, but you could have talked about more examples. Once again, going back to that example of China, you could have talked about international relations. I thought that was a really strong example, but it wasn't really elaborated upon. So just make sure that you are distributing your time more equally. And the point that you brought about debt forgiveness, you said that the government side said that the United States should take responsibility and forgive the debts of other countries, but I don't think that's what they said. They just said that inflating the dollar will have negative consequences on other countries' debts, but they never talked about forgiving. So, like an issue of accuracy, right? But overall, I think both teams did a good job. The opposition side, you guys did a really good job in clarity, logic, and weighing. Yeah. So, any questions on this decision?
I think we're good. Thank you so much for judging. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.
Thanks.